All right. How many of you actually took Tuesday off and did something that wasn't work or school related? You're working too much. You're studying too much. I can't say I did any better. I found preparing this lecture surprisingly more complicated than I had anticipated for a number of reasons. I ended up breaking it into two pieces. So today we'll be talking about the first piece, and then next Tuesday we'll finish up. And part of it was because I also identified a series of other things that I want to talk about. So I updated the next couple of lectures on Canvas this morning to what the topics are going to be. So, and what decided it should pop up in the middle of that screen there? That is very strange. Let's see here. All right. Some logistics things. I will have office hours again next Monday, 4 to 5 p.m. on Discord. I don't know if you've noticed, but if you actually message on Discord, I try to respond fairly quickly. Not instantly necessarily, because I'm not always sitting in front of the computer. And I don't know about you, but the number of notifications I get from Discord is just insane. How many of you use Discord? How many of you don't use Discord? That's the more interesting question. Right, okay. So, I mean, I guess old people use what? Like, does anybody still actually use Piazza here anymore? Because it wasn't even an option anymore when they got the class set up. I was like, oh, maybe they've killed Piazza finally. Because it's sort of a hideous platform. Speaking of data harvesting, by the way. What is Piazza's business model? Anybody know? Everybody's going to be looking for a job. They're all about trying to get you into a job and making money as a result of that. That's been their business model for a while. They also do sometimes offer or sell services to universities, but one of their big draws early on was it's free. But you're going to give them all your personal biographical information, and they can then turn it around and use that to sell to people who are recruiting. I actually did a random Discord Twitch streaming session the other day. Nobody actually popped in. That was fine. I mean, it's great. I can sit there in front of the computer and what was I doing? I mean, I don't know. I've been doing about 3 projects at a time the last couple of days. I was working on the current one up until around 1 this morning, and then I said I really should probably go get some sleep, so I slept in until 6:30. Let's see, Armin actually has, oops, I need to put a parentheses on the end of that Discord. He actually has a reminder in Discord now for when his office hours are on Discord, so I should do the same thing, then I'd actually remember to be in the channel as opposed to just simply monitoring. Project 2 is now open. I've seen some activity on that. I've seen a little bit of group formation. Actually, there's a fair bit of group formation. Groups are self-formed. In the end, what I'll do is I'll just capture that state in the self-formed groups and then build real Canvas groups for the grading side of things. So Canvas will only require you guys to submit once and blah, blah, blah. There's a formative check-in for Project 2 on the 7th, which is next Tuesday, I think. And my goal this time is to get that feedback to you faster. I asked the TAs yesterday. They both said they would have their grading on Project 1 done by tomorrow. If they don't have it done by tomorrow, what I will do is you will still get that feedback, but since I know that you're not really interested in the feedback, you're interested in the grade, I will give everybody who submitted something full marks. Because if they can't do it on time, I don't want to penalize you. That's my SLA. There was a check-in last week. So I took the data from last Thursday's check-in, did some sentiment analysis on it, and said, are there problems? I mean, I didn't look at every single one of them, but I did look at some, because the interesting thing in the sentiment analysis was we had mostly positive results, 56. There were 12 that were ranked as negative, and this is where the interesting part comes in. I was like, okay, well, what is in the negative? Is there some common trend here that I can actually action, that I can fix? And it turns out that this is actually an issue with the sentiment analyzer. It was using terms like, what's the example that I have? Risk as being a negative sentiment. So I did spend time looking at the 12 negative ones and said, these aren't actually negative. They have words that might associate with negative. And that's one of the interesting things about when you start using these kinds of tools. Because if you're building cloud applications that are interacting with people, you will become one more of the myriad of survey bot users out there. How many of you actually bother to respond to surveys anymore? Right. You're just overwhelmed by them. I mean, I remember I used to have a rule that I wouldn't do more than one a day, and now it's more, well, maybe I'll do one a month. Because they're continuous, constant. They always want your feedback. But they don't give you anything in return. I actually, I get the occasional survey where you'll be put into a drawing for a free Amazon gift card or whatever incentive they're giving you. I actually take the value of the card, divide it by the number of responses, and say that's what they value my time at. And you know what? I never come up with a value that I say it's worth my time. You're giving them far more than you're getting from them. But it doesn't matter. You're going to go out, you're going to work for a company, and they're going to say, oh, we need to survey our users and find out if they're happy. Claude Code is doing that. Anybody using Claude Code? 2.0. It's like a different tool. It's behaving differently. It's acting differently. The code it generates is acting differently. I started a project 2 days ago, and I have actual code and data working. I left home and it was running a test that was going to take an hour to run. And I was like, wow, this actually didn't build performative bullshit code. I didn't have to babysit it to do it either. And one of the things I discovered is I've been using OpenRouter. I ended up using OpenRouter because I'm doing a lot of work with LLMs, and one of the most annoying things about dealing with different LLMs models is that they each have their own APIs. Well, all right, they really have two. There's the Anthropic API, and there's the OpenAI API. And pretty much all of the other models will use one or the other or both of them. OpenRouter gives me a single interface and allows me to pick and choose between like 170 different models. Now, there's a cost associated with that. They mark up the token cost by 5%. And I'm like, yeah, but I only need one key here instead of having, I have like 10 different API keys. You know, I put $50 into each one of them, and okay, you're starting to talk about $500. That's a spendable amount of money. I mean, it's not a month's rent in Vancouver, mind you, but it's still a spendable amount of money. And so with OpenAI, or with the OpenRouter, I can actually just have one key, and it will deal with all of the sub-billing and all that whatnot. And it gives me access to models that I can't get otherwise. See, I'm interested in models that haven't been domesticated. And there are some, not a lot, but there are a couple in OpenRouter that I can play with. So you're going to do sentiment analysis. You're going to use tools like, this is Vader Sentiment, which is just a Python package that does keyword searching. It's not using an LLM. The reason I started looping in LLMs here is because, in fact, I also did this experiment with an LLM. Anonymize the data, submit it to the LLM, have it rank the sentiment. And it actually was the opposite. It was like, oh, everybody's negative. Because again, it's reading what you're writing, but it's not interpreting it properly. I think that was a framing issue more than anything else. The results you get from an LLM will depend upon what you ask it to do, how you frame the task. If I just hand you a bunch of 70, was it 68? 56, 12, and I think of the 8, 6 were non-commit, or didn't submit or something. I think it was 6 or 8. So the neutrals are basically people who didn't submit anything at all. So that would be 68 actual responses, which is a great response rate. And of course, that's just because there's an incentive that you decided made it worth your while. If I just give you all 68 of those and say, hey, what do you think? You're going to be like, I don't know. What do you want me to do with this? If I give you a clear set of instructions and I say, this is what I'm looking for, then you're going to get results based upon the instructions you gave it. So the negative sentiment analysis was really interesting to me because nobody actually said, oh, this class sucks. Now, maybe that's just because you're self-selecting. You decided not to drop this before the W date. Certainly is possible. But this is going to tie into the discussion today because one of the key elements of the discussion today is web scraping. And part of web scraping, which basically that's what this ends up being. You're downloading a bunch of garbagey data from Canvas. It's got embedded HTML inside of it, so we had to pull that out because otherwise we ended up with things like line break, the HTML line break indicator, or the no backspace indicator as being the most significant things in the feedback. And it's like, this is garbage. How many of you have actually done data analysis before? How many of you have actually done cleaning before you did your data analysis? Or after you did your data analysis and realized it was crap? Because dirty data doesn't generate good results. What does it mean for data to be dirty? Sorry? NA values, right? So things that are just missing. What am I supposed to do with that? I know, let's just make something up, right? Sometimes you do that. Sometimes you put 0 there, but that will, of course, skew your results. You have to be very careful of that. And sometimes you just realize that you have to throw some of the data out. But there are risks in throwing the data out. If Elon Musk walks into this room right now, every single person in here, on average, is a multimillionaire. Actually, I think we're all billionaires, but yeah, there's not 200 people in here, so therefore, we're all billionaires. We're all, on average, billionaires. That's the problem that you can end up with in data. You can end up with one data point that skews the entire set of results. And so you exclude that. But then there are risks with excluding those data points as well, because it mischaracterizes in a slightly different way. So you're picking the lesser of two evils there. How many of you have ever done web scraping? Right, so you use Beautiful Soup in Python, for example, to scrape. I've done it myself. I built an entire plagiarism detection system for Georgia Tech. And it downloaded stuff from Moss, which is a tool that Alex Aiken at Stanford built before you were born. And he still runs because I don't think he's emeritus yet. I think he's pretty close, though. What his tool does, it takes programs and it turns them into abstract syntax trees and then does similarity analysis based on the abstract syntax trees. What that means is that if you take a piece of code and you change the names of the variables or you even reorder some of the code, it doesn't change the AST, and it will identify that, yeah, you copied the code from someplace else. There's a very interesting paper, I think it was from Stanford actually, because I cited it in my own work, where they found that you had to have a certain threshold of code before you could argue that it was statistically significant. And that was about 30%. So if you had about 30% overlap, then it probably was plagiarized code. And I always challenge students is if you really think it's that easy to get away with taking someone else's code and like changing it around a little bit, I think you'd be surprised. I think you'd find that, in fact, the other side of this, which is if you sit down and write the same piece of code twice, so today you write an implementation, tomorrow you don't look at today's implementation, you just write it again, they won't actually compare as being the same unless they're really trivial. I mean, there are certain things that are really trivial, like you're writing in C and you're going to set up sockets, and there's really pretty much like one way to do it. But there are many, many degrees of freedom. Really interesting. Web scraping is the process of going to a website and pulling data out of that website. One of the interesting things that you will observe if you've used an LLM, and I'm assuming everyone in this class has used an LLM within the last 168 hours. If you ask it to go and look at a web page, it is increasingly likely that it will not be able to pull the content from the web page. Why? Oh, nobody pays attention to robots.txt, especially not when it's an LLM. In fact, they're actively blocking them. GitHub is now doing that. It is actively blocking auto-scanning by known AI provider IP addresses. And that's going to tie into our conversation today as well. So I got this chair here, and I'm going to put it right here. There's nobody sitting here. That's our empty chair today. That's the person who's affected by our decisions that we don't know, and we're not considering the cost. So today we're going to talk about the architecture of proxy servers, how proxy servers work, how we use them, the technical side of things. And on Tuesday, we're going to follow up and analyze what the actual impact is on the people sitting in that chair, or not sitting in that chair, the ones that we don't hear. How many of you know what a proxy server is? A couple of hands tentatively going, I'm afraid to admit that I know what a proxy server is. Does anybody know what the English word proxy means? A substitute, an agent, a representative. When you own shares of stock in a corporation, each year they will have a meeting. In Canada, they call them AGMs. In the US, they call them stockholder meetings or shareholder meetings, depending on the state. And if you show up at the meeting and you are an owner of stock in the company as of there's a specific date, the ownership date that you have to have had it by, then you can vote on proposals before the board of directors, or presented by the board of directors to the owners of the company itself. But let's suppose that you live in, Medellin. Beautiful city. You live in Medellin, and the meeting is in Toronto in February. Maybe you don't really want to make the trip from Medellin to Toronto in February to vote. And so what you do is you appoint someone to vote on your behalf. That is literally called a proxy. The statement you sign that gives someone else the authority to act on your behalf is called a proxy. They're not you, but they're acting on your behalf. In computer networking, a proxy is literally the same thing. Another computer that performs an operation on your behalf. This is a very simple idea, and yet it is used in innumerable different cloud computing services. You can do local content caching. So if you're in a corporate environment and they don't want to constantly be paying for the bandwidth to download the data from some remote site, what they'll do is they'll set up a caching server locally. And so you don't talk to the website, you talk to the caching server, and the caching server talks to the website. And it grabs the assets, and it puts the assets down into the cache. So when your neighbor hits the same website, they don't go all the way across the internet to grab it. They just grab the local copy of it. Because most of the time, these assets are static. They do not change. Even a dynamically generated web page is mostly static assets with a small amount of dynamic content. It's just more efficient. It makes the website work faster. Does anybody actually have internet service besides the UBC crappy Wi-Fi? The beautiful, wonderful UBC Wi-Fi. Anybody live at home where you have like your own ISP? Yeah, I see heads going. You have some sort of box sitting somewhere in some closet that you only notice when it stops working. Oh, the internet stopped working. Let's go reboot. Half of them don't even have switches. You have to unplug them and plug them back in. Or throw them over the balcony or whatever, you know. That's a proxy server. Almost always it's a proxy server. It sits between your computer and the wild, wild world of the internet. And it pretends to be you. All of the connections go through that box. There are a number of reasons we use network address translation. NAT is used primarily because it actually solved the IPv4 problem in a way that permitted us to actually not have to use IPv6 for, 30 years. We've actually reached the point, we've been at this point for a while, we've actually reached the point where people are really using IPv6 now. I don't know if you remember, but I mentioned that one of UBC's undergrads, I met him when he was working at Stanford. He was doing his PhD at Stanford, and what he ended up doing afterwards was help invent IPv6. So I get to share my retrospective on that, which is I was there. I listened to him talking about the interesting issues very early in the IPv6 development cycle. So for me, this is lived experience. For you, it's just something, yeah, whatever. It already happened. Network address translation is not going away. You're still going to have some sort of box between you and the outside world. We can call it a gateway. We can call it a router. We can call it a wireless access point. But they all end up doing exactly the same thing, which is they end up acting as proxies for you. So you connect to that, it connects to the outside world, and then the outside world sends messages back. If you want to be able to talk to your computer inside of your personal network from outside of your personal network, you have to do a tunnel. You have to put a hole through that proxy server so that an inbound connection can be connected to your computer. I do that. I can SSH to my Linux box in my home. I don't use port 22 for that. I use a different port number, which is not much security. And everything I do on that requires a public key certificate because I'm not using passwords. Passwords are just not. They're inherently insecure, and there are. Have you ever found a website that you run across and it leaves you unable to sleep at night? I'll give you one. It's called Shodan.io. If you've never gone to Shodan.io, it will scare you. It will tell you how many different databases of various types are using the default credentials. It scans everything. If you're really bored and you want to do some PLC programming, you can reprogram traffic lights in Malaysia because somebody has made the decision to put the traffic lights on the internet. And you can just simply snarl somebody's traffic. And it's constantly scanning. It's constantly looking, and it's very easy to search and find them. Load balancing is a very common mechanism we use in cloud computing. The idea behind a load balancer is I don't know how much traffic I'm going to have coming into my website, so how do I scale my website up? There's two ways I can scale my website up. One is I can scale horizontally. The other one is I can do vertically. Well, vertically means I just simply buy a bigger and bigger and more powerful computers, and that starts to get expensive at some point. Horizontally means I have a bunch of cheap computers spread out, and instead of me using one computer to satisfy all of the requests to a website, I route the requests to different computers who are processing exactly the same website. That's load balancing. There's also a failover model here inside of an automatic load balancer typically these days, and that is if one of those backing servers goes down, you can actually transparently reconnect to a different server, so the user's perspective is nothing happened bad except the website was a little bit slow. And this is a proxy service. You can do remote content caching. Have you ever heard of CloudFront? Checking to see if you're a real human being. It's hard to go on the internet and not see that occasionally. CloudFront is in fact what they now call a content distribution network, and what it does is it's a massive proxy server. If you want to protect your server, I do that with my own web server, my public-facing expert witness professional web server, website. I don't hang that out. Actually, no, it's a different one. I have a different machine that does it. But at any rate, I don't hang that out on the public internet. What I do instead is I have CloudFront accept the inbound connections, and then it sends them to my machine. It knows the actual IP address of my machine. My actual IP address is not exposed to the outside world, and it provides a very high degree of safety because it can't even discover where your machine is. So it can't attack you very easily. If I want to SSH into it, what I use is the IPv6 address, not the IPv4 address, because it's the IPv4 address that's being used by CloudFront. And I don't publish the IPv6 address. Have any of you ever used a virtual private network? A VPN? How many of you have not ever used a VPN or have never heard the term? All right, so I've made my point. You know what they are. Why do you use a VPN?
It's a company VPN.
It's a company VPN. So why does the company want you to use a VPN? What does a VPN do?
Reroutes, actually not too sure. It reroutes network traffic to a different place. The proxy.
It is a proxy service, actually. What it does is it creates an encrypted channel, an end-to-end encrypted channel, so that no one in between your computer and the company's computer can read the message. That's the function of a virtual private network. It literally creates a private communications channel over a public internet. You used it for corporate purposes. Has anyone used a VPN for anything else?
I was in China and I couldn't access.
Right. So he was in China and he found that he could use the UBC VPN to... Oh, the UBC VPN doesn't work because it's like when I was in China, one of the two that I used, it's either Georgia Tech or UBC, one of them worked and one of them didn't, and it was really weird. But yes, right. So China does block some.
Right, most outbound traffic in other regions.
Yeah. Right. Anybody else use a VPN for anything?
I tried to use a VPN to bypass the Netflix region restrictions.
So he tried to use a VPN to, I like the word tried. I tried to use the VPN to bypass the Netflix region restrictions. What happened?
It was kind of intermittently successful.
Intermittently successful. Okay. This is another example of a proxy service. The proxy part of it is that it makes it look like your machine is physically located in a different place. When I was doing the Groupon investigation, I used a VPN to make it look like I was in Las Vegas, Nevada. I use a VPN service that gives me the ability to pick the exit point. And I pay for my VPN because I don't want to be the product. Although you can pay for the VPN and still be the product. So you have to be very careful with them. Today's YouTube video is actually a really interesting discussion about all of the VPN products available in one of the app stores. I think it was actually, might have been the Apple one, probably. Virtual private networks are used extensively. They are used for doing things like bypasses, geographical restrictions. When I'm traveling and I can't actually access, my Paramount subscription, because I got it in Canada and I'm in the US and I'm like, really? So I have to use a VPN in order to be able to use it. But then it works. And if you're really clever, you can figure out that, in fact, getting some of these subscriptions is cheaper in India than it is here, or cheaper in Mexico, because I've spent a bunch of time in Mexico. And if you buy your subscription in Mexico and you just keep using a VPN to Mexico, you're paying half the price you are here. That's a little bit of a hassle sometimes. So most people don't do it. There are filters. Anybody ever heard about these filters that like parents can put on children's computers to prevent them from accessing websites, and the parents find they can't access the websites, and the kids figure out how to do it pretty quickly anyway? I see smiles, so that means that people do know what I'm talking about. These are another form of proxy service. They are filters that are on your own machine, or they could be filters on your network. How many of you know what a pie hole is? Good, because we'll be talking about domain name services next Thursday. Don't you like those foreshadowing things? And then we have general purpose proxies. I actually have used, with mixed success, weird behaviors occasionally, I actually used gaming proxies where they choose optimized routes to exit points so that you can get better latency when you're gaming. I mean, I have an EU account, and I can tell you that if I don't use the proxy, I get about 155 millisecond round trip times, ping times. And if I use it, I get about 140. But anytime I enter an instanced dungeon, there's a risk that it will time out and it just won't transfer it properly. And I'll get it takes me like 60 seconds before I finally get kicked out, and then I go in and it's fine. So I don't use it very much. If I was on the east, when I was in the Boston area a couple of years ago and I was gaming, and it was like 60 milliseconds to get to EU from the eastern US versus 150 here. So 150 is not bad. If you play against people who are in Australia, New Zealand, play with them, it's about 200, and that's still playable. But much above that, and it starts to become a big disadvantage. I put together a proxy primer and a proxy handbook. They are on Canvas. The links in the PDF should work. They definitely are. They do work from the pages on Canvas as well. The goal was to give you something that will help you understand how we use proxy services. In addition, a lot of the work that I'm talking about is based upon an investigation that I did now 6 years ago. It was like, oh my gosh, where does the time go? 6 years ago for a company called Luminati. Well, at the time they were called Luminati. Now they're called Bright Data. Have you ever heard of Bright Data? If you start doing web scraping, you will. And it was litigation between a company called UAB Teso Limited and Luminati Inc. UAB Teso Limited is a Lithuanian company, and Bright Data, formerly Luminati, is an Israeli company. And they were suing each other all over the place. So Luminati had sued Teso in East Texas in court, and Teso had sued Luminati in Vilnius District Court in Lithuania. So I actually included a link to my report, because it's a public record document. I actually included a link to the report that I wrote because the Illuminati people at the end said, wow, this is really good. I want to be able to hand this to my new engineers so they understand what it is we do. I had never figured out how it was that free VPN services made money. But I'm going to teach this because it really ties into cloud computing. Because one of the important things we do is web scraping. And one of the complications with web scraping is the people we're scraping don't want us to scrape them. So it's a cat and mouse game. We started off, what's that? That's revolutionary? Yes, in 1993 this was revolutionary because before 1993 I was using Archie and Gopher. And then somebody came along, from CERN actually, somebody built this thing called a browser, Mosaic, the Mosaic project. And it was a graphical front end to the internet, which had a small amount of effect. But this is the basic model that it and everything before it and everything after it has used. We have a client, we have a server. In essence, that's the cloud. This is your client, and that server is somewhere else. That's what makes it cloud. Did I wear that shirt yet? I have a really cool shirt that says, it's a kid and his dad. And he says, Dad, what are clouds made of? And the dad says, Linux servers mostly. You got to have dad jokes, right? We added a proxy server in here because it does things like that caching. And that was actually the original idea, that somebody said, hey, we're downloading the same stuff over and over and over again. For all the computers on our network, it would be a lot more efficient because this is the world of 56K dial-up. You haven't lived until you've actually surfed the web over a 56K dial-up connection. All right, I'm old enough to remember 300 baud modems. You'd actually take the handset from an old telephone and you plug it into these things like little plungers that would grab it, and then it would make sounds and it would translate the sounds. That was 300 bits per second. So 56K sounded like really fast in those days. And now, I complain because I've only got 1 gigabit at home. How come I don't have 3 gigabit yet? Because I don't know what I'd do with that. But I know what the free VPN people will do with it. A residential proxy is a specific instance where we don't communicate directly with the server. We go through a series of residential nodes. So our proxy service here is in fact responsible for picking and choosing one of our residential sources and making it look like the messages, the packets are coming from each of those residential nodes. ChatGPT actually drew these. It now generates SVG drawings that are better than I could do and faster, because I think it takes about a minute to do that, and it takes me a minute just to get Illustrator fired up. Why would you do this? I mean, I already told you. Let's see if anybody was awake. Why would you do that? What is the purpose of using a residential proxy service? How many of you use the internet to shop? All right, and those who are not raising their hands are just lying, but that's okay. How many of you order from Temu or, there's AliExpress, but that's probably the only thing old people use now, or Amazon? It's all the same, right? The difference is that with Amazon, you pay for next day service. Somebody else bought it off of Temu, brought it over, stocked it in an Amazon warehouse, and now you're buying it and Amazon will deliver it to you for, 20 times the price. When your Temu thing doesn't show up ever, you just go, oh, too much hassle, I'm not going to worry about it. And when your Temu stuff shows up and it's a fake product, you go, wow. When your Amazon stuff shows up and it's fake, then you can actually get a little antsy. I actually had that happen once. I had a fake pair of Levi's show up from Amazon, not from a third-party vendor. It was like, wow. And I forgot to do it in the 30 days, so I bought another pair, and then I took the pair that were fake, and I sent them back. I didn't feel like I was really cheating there. Why would you use a residential proxy? I just gave you the answer. If you're scraping shopping websites to do price analysis, you can't block the residential proxies because those are your customers. Those are the people who are trying to give you money. Time to take your meds? And this is really simple to implement. Yeah?
Wait, what's the residential proxy exactly?
It means that someone is sending a message through a residential computer. Literally, it looks like it came from your computer because it did come from your computer, but the actual recipient is hidden or masked because that residential computer is acting as a proxy for the originator of the request. That's a great question. Now, does it make sense why you'd use this? Yeah. I mean, it's really easy to do this, right? It's just literally a store and forward kind of model. And then when the response comes back, you match it up with the connection and you send it back to the original sender of the message. It's a few lines of Python code, done. The Tesla, oh, okay, good, I did have a link for it. The Tesla versus Illuminati case was all involved in really in the residential proxy side of the business. That's what I found fascinating about it, is because I was like, well, why don't you just set up a VP, why don't you just use data centers to do this stuff? Because they'll block data centers. They can't block residential proxies. My role in this litigation, I didn't actually get involved in the patent litigation. I put my hat in the ring, but that was high profile, and they wanted somebody who had an MIT or Stanford PhD. And let me just tell you, most of the reports I've seen from people with MIT or Stanford or Berkeley PhDs, the reports are written by someone else and they just sign off on it for a large sum of money. I know because I just helped a company called Gray B write one of those prospective reports, and they literally had the whole thing filled out, templated, for signing by somebody with a Stanford PhD. And I looked at it and I said, your analysis is all wrong, and I fixed it for them. And they paid me. So life is good. How much do you think you earn as an expert? Hopefully you never actually have to hire an expert witness. How much do you think an IP litigation lawyer charges? Most IP litigation is in the US, so let's do it in US dollars. Take a guess. Sorry?
6 figures.
6 figures. There's not a lot that do 6 figures, but people who actually do trials will charge well above $1,000 an hour. I had the opportunity to work with Drew Winteringham, who was the head of IP litigation at DLA Piper. And DLA Piper at the time was, and probably still is, the largest law firm in the world. They have an office here in Vancouver. And it's just a small satellite office, but they have offices all over the world, including in China. And he ran their IP litigation department, and he hired me to work on one of the cases. And I know his bill rate was well in excess of $2,000 or $3,000 an hour. When I do expert work, I charge $600 an hour. It's decent money. So if I disappear for a day and tell you I can't come to class, it'll be because I'll be able to earn in one day what they'll pay me to teach this class for the term. I like you guys, but, nobody's blaming me at this point either, are they? You do the same thing. So I actually included the report because the report was public. There was no court order. There was no confidentiality. What do they call it? Protective order. There was no protective order in this case. I put the dual language version there as well. So you can see what a dual language expert report looks like. It was done in English and Lithuanian. And my Lithuanian is non-existent, but I worked with their translators to make sure that it was done. So it's all dual and parallel. Very nice. So, all right, now we got to have this ethical lens because I put this empty chair here for a particular reason. How are we exploiting people? How do we build these residential proxies? What kind of exploitation model do we get? And why did I keep talking about free VPNs? Because free VPNs, or free proxy services, but free VPNs are far more common. And essentially they're the same thing. One's just an encrypted channel over the other. A free VPN service is something that people might very well use because they want to maintain their privacy or anonymity. Guess what? You probably aren't. So how much are we exploiting here? Well, the number of requests per day by how many, the percentage of the bypasses here, plus whatever the cost is, the harm coefficient. So in other words, if somebody's using 40% of your bandwidth, they're using 40% of the money that you're paying. Now maybe you don't care because your bandwidth, you're not touching most of that bandwidth, but instead of using 10% of your bandwidth, now you're using 50% of your bandwidth because they're using 40%. And they're maximizing their value out of it. Right, I knew there was a visualization somewhere that I didn't put in here. That was the one. It was supposed to give you a hockey stick. Okay, so close your eyes. Imagine you're in Canada and you've got a hockey stick in front of you that shows you exponential growth. There, done. If your upload speed is 15 megabits per second, which is probably really fast for UBC Wi-Fi, how many people love UBC Wi-Fi? How many people think it's the greatest thing since the paperclip? Exactly. How many of you think that UBC Wi-Fi sucks? That was the most polite term I could come up with. Right. And how many of you don't use UBC Wi-Fi? And some people just don't raise their hands because they're too tired, because they've been working too hard on this class. So if they're using 40% of your bandwidth, then they're basically getting $32 worth of monthly value based on whatever you're paying, and so their annual revenue from that is $338. Now this is actually completely hypothetical. In fact, the numbers are much higher than this. So I said, I want to know what are the current prices that these companies are charging for residential proxies, and let's compare them to other kinds of proxies. A residential proxy per gigabyte transferred is $3.50 on the low end and $4.20 for typical. Now it can go down depending on, if you're buying it in very large volumes. It can also go up if you decide that you want something that's specific to a geographical region. So if you want to be in downtown Vancouver, for example, because that's where your clients are, then you pay more. Static residential IP addresses are cheaper because they can be blocked. If they get overused, what you will find, so you're using your free VPN service on your static IP address, and suddenly you start noticing that websites are blocking you because of illicit traffic, and that's because someone's proxying through you. If you use VPN services that are using shared endpoints, you will find that happens. Google will block you. Not because of anything you've done, but because of other people's activity on the same IP address. Because that's the only thing they can use to distinguish it. Now let's look at a data center. Notice that the data center per gigabyte is, on the low end, 65 cents per gigabyte. That's a little bit of a difference. Let's see, that's almost 300%? Roughly 65, 130, 260, yeah. It's like they're getting 6x the price? 6x the price, so 600% for residential proxies versus data center proxies. That's because data center proxies are easily blocked because we know what IP addresses have been given to the data center, so we can block the entire range, and they do it. If you're using a data center IP, it's actually higher quality. So if there's a specific IP address in a data center that you own versus you're using a generic pool, we can do better. We can get a little bit more money, but it's still a third. 1/3. Now you understand why residential proxies are so incredibly valuable. They're hard to block, and someone is paying that differential because that means they're much more useful when you're trying to do things like, oh, I don't know, web scraping. And that is accurate as of yesterday, but these things change. So why do we use residential proxies? They're really, really effective for web scraping and data aggregation. That's probably their single biggest use. If you wanted to be able to bypass the LLM getting blocked downloading thing, have a local LLM that can download stuff from the web. Guess what? It'll work fine because it will look like you're downloading it from that website, not the data center in, I don't know, Amazon's, Western 2 division or whatever. It's fun. I've actually been using OpenRouter, and one of the really cool things in OpenRouter is that I can see every single request that I sent and where it was routed. And I was like, wow, it sends it to Google, it sends it to Amazon, it sends it to Anthropic, it sends it to, like all these different data centers. Who knew? You're sitting there thinking, well, I'm just having a conversation with one data center. No. Each new message in an LLM is a complete package. Everything you've already said, plus the new thing you said, and that's what gets packaged in the inference engine, and then it generates a response, and that comes back. Well, I guess if you think about it that way, these are stateless, and therefore they can go anywhere, and they do. I was using Grok 4 free quite a bit today. I was kind of surprised. There are actually free LLMs that you can use through OpenRouter, and it was trivial. I just simply said, use this model, and it did. And I looked at the charges. I could see the everything going in, and I wasn't getting charged for it. That's awesome, especially when you're doing testing. The quality of Grok 4 free isn't necessarily very high. And of course, if you're giving your data to someone for free, what are they doing with it? They're using it. They're monetizing it. No one's going to give you anything for nothing. Ad verification. You can use that for detecting fraud. It was a nice phishing message today because it's clearly somebody, one of my contacts, who's a lawyer, who is one of these very expensive lawyers. I know that you work with interesting people. Has anybody heard of this country called the United States? Well, a number of years ago, they had a president who had ostensibly lost an election, but he claims he didn't, and he was impeached. And they had a trial in the US Senate, and there was a man who stood up to defend him. I've worked with that man. Like I said, you meet very interesting people. And I got an email from him today. And of course, it contained an embedded document that it wanted me to click. And I'm like, okay, I'll go check it and see. I'm like, this is probably bullshit, and indeed it was. And if you looked at the actual image, somewhere it said Microsoft with a 0. The O is a 0. I'm like, okay, well, you got to put a tel in there somewhere, right? And indeed, the web page was blocked. And I tried to go look at it, and that web page was blocked too. And I'm like, this is too much trouble. So I took the headers from the email, I sent him back a message, I said, I think you've been hacked. And you go on. So a $1,000 an hour lawyer might not be very tech savvy, and there's nothing wrong with that. Actually, it's great. That's how I can go charge him $600 an hour. E-commerce monitoring, this is a big one actually. It turns out that doing price checks is a huge thing, and the only real way to do this effectively is with a residential proxy. Geo-restricted content access. Again, if you're trying your Netflix trick, you're going to find that a VPN service that is using residential proxies is going to have a higher success rate. But it's not going to have as high a success rate as if your buddy lets you VPN into their gateway and then connect outwards, because that unless they're running a free VPN service, that's not going to trigger. That one's going to bypass. Well, I forgot to turn the power on. It's nice that it reminds me of this. Did you bring enough for everyone?
No.
Did you order that from Uber Eats or something?
No?
You had a friend bring it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. The free Uber Eats. Yo, I'm starving, I'm in class. This guy just bores me to tears. Can you, bring me something to eat? Account management. It turns out that people who do social media marketing often have multiple accounts and they don't want them to all appear to come from the same location. But the big one there is cybersecurity and IP privacy. So you want to mask your IP, you want to enhance your anonymity. And this one has the connotations, the conversation that leads me to put this chair here, because this is going to be the one that most profoundly affects people you've never even considered. See, data privacy is a two-edged sword. It allows you to be a journalist in a foreign country where your messages are being monitored, and so you want to be able to report things cleanly. But that residential proxy could be sending traffic for not so savory purposes or not so noble purposes. They could be going to a gambling site. They could be for a torrent stream. An encrypted Tor node. Do people know what Tor is? Tor is a browser originally developed by the US Department of the Navy, believe it or not, that permitted very anonymous interactions across the internet using a sophisticated network of exit points, proxy servers, basically. It made it extremely difficult to track back. Not impossible if you compromised one of the end nodes, and that's the most successful way of doing it. If you compromise one or more of the end nodes, then you can figure out where the traffic is coming from inside of the network. And they continue to work on it. The Tor project is still alive. You can still download the Tor browser. It's slow because it really does actually obfuscate traffic. But that means the packets are coming out from all over the internet in no easily discernible pattern. Have any of you ever heard of the dark web? Of course. How many of you actually have gone onto the dark web? How about this? How many of you have not gone onto the dark web? Raise your hands. Why not? What, are you not curious? I mean, how else do you buy your, nuclear weapons or... And the dark web is, in fact, a highly anonymous set of websites where people really do exchange things that are of dubious or questionable moral turpitude. And that can include weapons. There's a big market in selling not just guns, but ammunition and missiles and attack vehicles and all sorts of things. I mean, it's not like you're just going to put that up on Amazon and start selling it. Doesn't really happen. But they are available for sale. How many of you have ever heard of Bitcoin? Bitcoin is a common currency that is often used for this. It's actually not the best currency to use for this because Bitcoin is not anonymous. Bitcoin has a non-anonymous, it's considered to be a public ledger, and the weak spot in its anonymity is when you change it from fiat currency to Bitcoin or vice versa. So when you put money into the system or you take money out of it, that goes through someone who's heavily regulated and will be able to associate you with that transaction. If you just simply trade Bitcoin on the Bitcoin network itself, yeah, we can see the transaction, but we don't know whose wallet that is. We don't know who controls that wallet. Monero is actually better for this because that makes it harder to track. But again, the weak spot is the same. It's the money brokers. You've got your streaming piracy. Well, right, you're trying to run Netflix from some other region. And Netflix is weird there because I can run my Netflix account in Mexico and I can get stuff. But of course, I get what's available in Mexico, not what's available in Canada or the United States or Sweden. Because you know that Swedish Netflix is very subversive. How many of you have ever been to Sweden? you really got to go. Especially in the summer when the days are like, the sun comes up at 4 in the morning and goes down around 11:30 at night. Those are the sweet spot. You're like, I'm just going to sleep for 3 hours and get back up and go spend more time in the sunshine. Here's the problem. And this is where, like I said, this got kind of difficult as I was putting this lecture together. Okay, so how do I tell the difference between gaming traffic and CSAM traffic? And now my real question is, does anyone know what CSAM means? Good. It's child porn. This is the politically correct, polite term, child sexual abuse material. Now here's a more interesting question. Did any of you ever engage in sexting when you were still under the age of 18? Maybe I should ask the question in a reverse way. Did anybody not do that? This is computer science people, so they might be a little more geeky about that. I see faces turning red. It's really kind of interesting. It's like, okay, but my point is that what you did is in fact a crime. That it's really weird, but in many jurisdictions, the mere ownership of pictures of someone under the age of 18, nude or in a sexually provocative position, is a crime just to have it. Maybe there's somebody in here who actually likes that kind of porn. It's surprisingly common. I've mentioned this before. There are people who actually build filtering products to look for child porn. They hire contractors to look at images that are suspected child porn. There's a whole mechanism for automating the process of identifying likely candidates. And then they have a human look at it. And without a doubt, unless you are a psychopath, it is a job that will burn you out in a matter of weeks, because it is real material that real people create. But here's the flip side of this. You're using a free VPN service. That free VPN service is being used to send traffic out through your machine. What is the risk there? Who's sitting in this chair? I'm going to give that someone a name. It turns out it's actually really hard to find data on this. It is a problem. I know it's a problem. I've been involved in cases of it. But before we get there, I wonder why I put the studio here. But before we get there, I wanted you to actually go through the HOLA end user license agreement. HOLA is Bright Data, Luminati. And HOLA is the name of their, one of their products. I want you to go through, just get together, go through that end user license agreement and privacy policy and read through them and come up with one clause control test sequence for each of them. And then we'll talk about it. So I'll set a 5-minute timer. This will give you something to actually look at. And timer. You do it in groups, don't do it alone. Feel free to use your LLM. I encourage it. How many of your other classes get to say that? Oh, good Lord, just pick one. So. Enjoying it?
Enjoying what?
Conversation, the class, the lecture, the
Yeah.
reading the, I mean, how often do you sit down and actually read an end user license agreement and start going, what the fuck am I agreeing to?
Yeah.
Sharing some data.
Yeah.
All right. So, tell me what one clause stood out. Registration and security. What does it say?
In order to activate some of these services, you will have to create an account and sign up.
Okay. So you have to sign up for an account. Okay. Anybody else? Different one?
The how is it free clause. In return for free usage of Hola free VPN proxy, you may appear on the Bright Data network.
There you go. Does that not tell you that you could be used as an exit point for child porn? How could you not read that and immediately understand the ramifications of it? Anybody else? Wow, people got quiet. I know, you go to every class and they talk about child porn, right?
There's a clause that says Hola will make its best effort not to enable any use of your device's resources unless your resources are at that time idle and are not using your battery power or roaming.
There you go. So that's an interesting clause, right? Because that says that they've promised that they're not going to drain your phone or your iPad or something if you're using their services. Okay, so that's something that we could actually turn into a clause control and test. How would we do that? How would you test for conformance for that part of the terms of service? Monitoring the network traffic on the computer. So you'd have to put something on a device that you were using under test to do that. Okay, fair enough. I mean, if you're building apps like that, you probably do have people testing them all over the world, because that's the way we test mobile phone apps these days. There are companies that contract for that. So you could actually make sure that the test framework itself monitors when we're using the device, to make sure that we're using the device within the constraints. So now we actually have at least a model for how we would test that. If you were an engineer working on an app and you had not read that clause, would you put that test into your code? Sorry? No. Is engineering management going to come and say, make sure that we're not using the customer's device when it's not idle? No, because that's not important to them. But let's suppose that somebody screws up and it ends up using somebody's device and it causes them problems, or whatever, and enough people get together and they sue the company. Guess who they will come and ask, why did you add this feature? Right. You. Why would a company do that? Why would they not protect you? What is a company's obligation? What is their legal obligation? They protect the company. A company's objective is to maximize the profits for their shareholders. That's the legal obligation. In fact, the practical obligation is they protect the interests of some of their shareholders over others. To quote George Orwell, some pigs are more equal than others. And if you don't know that reference, that's to a novel called 1984, which, if you read it, you'll go, oh my gosh, I'm living in this world. The major owners of a corporation, Zuckerberg, for example, is mostly interested in protecting Zuckerberg, not you. You can choose to do what they tell you, and you probably will end up making those kinds of compromises. My recommendation is just make sure you document it. Make sure you say, this is what our terms of service say. We need to make sure that we're abiding by that. And if they say, don't bother with it, don't worry about it, get it in writing or confirm it with an email or something, so that when they come for you later, you can pull that up. There's a whole bunch of Veronicas about that. Anybody ever seen Veronica on YouTube? Oh, well, I've included a link to at least one. And Veronica is just this little stick figure drawing. It's always about exploitation in workplaces. And my favorites are when her boss insists that things didn't happen. She says, I have email. Do you want me to pull it up? Protect yourself, because they're not going to be protecting you. Okay, now you're probably sitting there saying, but I'm never going to build a VPN service. And that might actually be true, but you're going to build an awful lot of things that are going to behave similar to that. You're going to be using APIs that handle user data. You're going to use aggregation services, just like Flow. You're going to use data scrapers. It doesn't matter whether it's because somebody's actually physically taken the covers off of books and scanned them in and then OCR'd them and fed them into LLMs. There are some very interesting examples of that, where there's this one term that shows up because of an OCR error in some old book. And it's a term that no one ever uses but shows up in LLMs. So you can actually give it the term and it'll actually find that term. Now, when that gets reported, they fix it. This morning, I spent time putting together a set of 600 LLM prompts that have, about half of which have malicious intent, because the system I've been working on the last 2 days is, how do I take an LLM prompt and look at it to see if it is an attempt to manipulate the system in advance? Really interesting, because I'm using Claude and I use Perplexity to actually go find sources. Turns out there's a lot of sources for manipulative prompts. Now, getting them was a little more challenging. In one case, Claude Code was trying to use an agent, and the agent refused to download them because it thought we were engaged in malicious activity. And it's like, no, no, of course, we're downloading all these malicious prompts because we're trying to protect the AI against manipulation. Oh, okay, well, that changes everything. I bet you've never heard that one. That changes everything. It's one of those performative things that Claude does. I call it every single time it does it. I said, that's your performative tick. Just be honest with me. And of course, all those free tiers that are supported by user data. Every distributed system has people here. People we're not hearing about. I wasn't sure exactly what the timing on this was going to be, so I'm actually going to stop here. And I'm going to take these slides, and I will move the next section of the slides because they are really going to go more into what the impact is. But I'm going to give you a name. I'm going to give you the name of someone who is impacted by this, and that name is Claude Wang. This is a person who was awakened at 4:30 in the morning when the police arrived at his residence and knocked on his door and arrested him for possession of CSAM. They seized his devices, they arrested him, they took him, they booked him. His neighbors were awakened and they saw that. And the police were perfectly happy to tell them that he was being arrested for CSAM. It turns out this is not that uncommon. One of the reasons I know about this is because I have actually had to work in instances where we've been able to show that people had a free VPN service installed on their computer, and unbeknownst to them, it was being used to distribute CSAM. The police can use that as probable cause to arrest you, seize your devices. If that happened to you, how many of you have the wherewithal to come up with $100,000 to hire a lawyer? Because I can tell you that these kinds of lawyers that will handle these cases are few and far between. Because the moment you've been arrested, everyone in your social circle will assume you're guilty. You know who can get away with this? The people who can afford to spend $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 on lawyers to defend them. There's this guy down in the US who ostensibly hung himself, named Jeffrey Epstein. Maybe you've heard that name. If you haven't, he was notorious. He was convicted of sexual trafficking. And he was very well connected with a lot of very influential people in politics and business, including Bill Gates. The President of the United States said that he did not actually sign a birthday book that was given to Jeffrey Epstein, and yet we've since seen the birthday book. These people are not prosecuted for that. And do you know why? They can afford the lawyers. So how many of you could afford a lawyer if this happened to you? We'll finish this up on Tuesday.